Hello, everyone. Welcome to the British History Channel. I'm Philippa, and whether you've been here before or you're new, then thank you for watching and listening today. Today's show, we're going to complete the mini-series, which is looking at Henry VIII's divorce and the 1527 sack of Rome. So this is the third and final episode of this mini-series. Don't worry if you haven't caught the other two, because this one will stand alone. The other two gives context and are interesting in and of their own right. In the first episode, I covered the events which had led up to 20,000 imperial troops at the walls of Rome, bent on plunder and destruction. In episode 2, I went into the actual sack of Rome, and it certainly wasn't for the faint-hearted. It was a difficult subject to cover, but important in the context of what we'll be discussing today. And in this episode today, we're looking at the circumstances around Henry VIII approaching the Pope for an annulment to his first marriage, that, of course, to Katherine of Aragon, what Henry referred to as his great matter, and put it into the context of the events that we covered in the past two episodes. But like I say, even if you haven't seen the last two episodes, you won't need them for today. It will just be nice context. If you do fancy going back and having a look or a listen, they are available on YouTube and Facebook, and also on my Substack, which I was hoping to do live tonight, but that's not worked. So we'll try that again another day. You can also, maybe you are listening back on the British History podcast. That is also available to you if you need to catch up on any episodes. So I am streaming live on YouTube and Facebook. I was hoping to stream for the first time live on Substack, but that isn't working. The go live button just keeps rejigging itself and not doing anything. So anyway, never mind. A warm welcome to you if you're joining me live. Thank you so much. I can see people saying hi in the comments. I do appreciate you being here. And if you're watching, whether you're watching live or on the later on, please do give this video a thumbs up, a star, a super chat, whatever it is. I would be more than grateful. And as well as what I said we're going to cover today, we've also got, of course, our not weekly, episodic 3-minute explainer, because, and I've been waiting to do this one because this is related to the topic. Tina asked me a little while ago to cover what my thoughts are on whether or not Catherine of Aragon consummated the marriage with Arthur. So we're going to cover that after the main topic today. I also, to finish off, have to share with you what AI has conjured up for me this week when I've asked it to help me create a video to represent a historic event. Honestly, they get worse. A reminder, though, before we get on to it, that patrons on my Patreon, we are on to our next book, and I've got a bit of an announcement about this. So our book for the May meeting, which has happened on the 4th of May, is Son of Prophecy by Nathan Armin. Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. Our meeting will be on the 4th of May. Like I say, it's on Zoom, so people join from around the world. And very excitedly, we'll have the meeting, and then we will be joined by Nathan. He will be answering your questions and basically just coming in and joining in with the after the main meeting. So if you fancy reading history books and getting to discuss them with fellow history lovers, fellow history geeks, whatever you want to describe us as, then book club is great. It's part of my Patreon, and my Patreon is £5 a month, and you get all of the benefits. But like I say, this next meeting is extra special because we actually are going to have Nathan join us. Okay. So all of that being said, just a reminder, if you are watching and you're enjoying, please do give it a thumbs up and a like and all of that kind of thing. Because I think while I'm live, it does help other people maybe see the live stream as well. So that's all very helpful. So what I'll do is I will start off with a bit of a summary of the last episode. So the imperial troops of Charles V are at the walls of Rome. They're tired. They're disgruntled. I'd argue they were dehumanized to a large extent. And episode 1 is the one to go to if you want to find out why I think that. They'd marched on Rome, or marched to Rome, intent on plunder. They had been on a prolonged, badly provisioned campaign. The imperial troops were part Spanish Catholic and part Lutheran German. And because they're mercenary forces, they're getting paid. But they'd found themselves without pay, without reliable food or water supplies, badly provisioned campaign. Their commanders included a French general, Charles III, Duke of Bourbon, which we heard a lot about in the first episode. And him and the other commanders were hanging on to control by a thread. Really, it was all going rather wrong. And by the time they reached Rome in early May 1527, I mean, the men no longer had proper boots on their feet. They'd left the last of the ordnance, the last of the cannon behind, because the weather had made it just too difficult to move the heavy ordnance. I was going to say machinery, it's not machinery. They're starving, they're dirty. I've put they're possibly psychologically damaged. I think they're definitely psychologically damaged from the harsh conditions that they'd endured. And their final action, it was desperate, it was despicable. They were going to sack, by plan, the holy city itself, Rome. People, property were attacked, libraries, books were destroyed, art was destroyed, churches, monasteries and nunneries were raided, their inhabitants tortured and humiliated. One quote from a contemporary historian, the Venetian Marin Senuto, summed it up, just saying, "Hell was a more beautiful sight to behold." The Pope had taken refuge in Castel San Angelo, but after 8 weeks, the starving people inside had surrendered, and Clement had the Pope Clement VII had brokered a peace deal. The acts of violence, though, and this was all covered in episode 2, if you want to know more, they lasted for acts of violence, excuse me, and hostage taking in order to try and extract more money were going on for months afterwards. Eventually, the ruined city, now full of the stench of decomposing bodies, that was running into food shortages, and disease was rife. So that is the background from from where we are when we get to Henry VIII's, the beginning really of Henry VIII's divorce. So back in England, they're unaware of the assault on the Holy City. Obviously, communication channels aren't quite as quick as they are now. And on the 17th of May, there is a secret ecclesiastical court held at Westminster to examine Henry VIII's concerns over his marriage, what we know would become known as the King's Great Matter. And the 22nd of June, Henry goes to Catherine, tells her they must separate, and that he's sent to Rome to the Pope to ask for an annulment. Now, England, in England, Henry's Great Matter is going to dominate England's foreign and domestic policy and the royal court for the foreseeable future. Anyone with an interest in Tudor or English or British history will know that in the narratives and dramatizations of Henry's reign, his divorce from Catherine and his subsequent marriage to Anne Boleyn is a dominant theme. And perhaps that's a very good representation of how it would have been in real life, because it was the dominant issue. So I want to take you all the way back and have a look at the marriage which Henry is trying to finish. And I've used the word divorce because it's a little more clear to a general audience. But in fact, what Henry's looking at is an annulment, but we'll probably cover that. We will cover that. Henry VIII, he becomes king on the death of his father, Henry VII, on the 21st of April, 1509. He's 17 years old. And this is it was the first peaceful transfer of power since 1421, so almost a century. By the time of his 18th birthday on the 28th of June, Henry was already a married man. He'd married Katherine of Aragon, as we know, daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. And the couple had married on the 11th of June at Greenwich Palace. And this appears to have been very much Henry's own decision. What it was not, however, was his own idea. So back in 1503, at Richmond Palace, Henry VII's favourite palace, a marriage treaty was agreed between the king, Henry VII, and representatives of the Spanish rulers, Isabella and Ferdinand, for their recently widowed daughter, Catherine, to be re-wed, if you like, but wed to the new heir, Prince Henry. So its purpose, this marriage treaty, the purpose of this was to maintain the Anglo-Spanish alliance, which they'd thought to have secured by the bride's previous marriage in 1501 to Henry's elder brother, Arthur. Now, Arthur, Prince of Wales, had died only 5 months into their marriage, leaving this left Catherine somewhat in a state of limbo. Her marriage contract to Arthur had included the payment of a dowry, and this dowry was to be paid in 2 parts. The first part was paid at the wedding, but the second hadn't been paid by the time of Arthur's premature death in April 1502. Catherine, who would probably have preferred maybe to return to Spain, obviously has no say in what happens to her. Henry VII controls her person, and while he wants that second half of the marriage dowry, he isn't going to let Catherine go. So in this circumstance, planning another marriage seems the most favourable solution to everyone involved, perhaps even to Catherine. The marriage treaty, so drawn up at Richmond, includes a recognition that a papal dispensation is going to be required because the bride has been married to the groom's older brother. And under canon law, that was forbade. What Catherine made of that need for this dispensation, did she know about this part of the marriage treaty? Maybe if she did, she just thought it was a necessary step, a admin part of the process, belts and braces, whatever. There's no record of her protesting that the dispensation wasn't required. However, anyway, the treaty, which had been ratified on the 3rd of March 1509, was supposed to be solemnised once Henry turned 14 on his birthday on the 28th of June 1505, but it never was solemnised. Now, it could have been that this lack of a second payment, Henry VII is trying to hold out for this second part of Catherine's original dowry. Or another possible reason, or maybe it's both at the same time, was that by this point, Isabella, Catherine's formidable mother, had died. She died on the 26th of November 1504, so right in the middle of this time period. And Catherine, with her mother deceased, was not so much of a prize without the powerful Castile as part of the alliance. So the wedding was never obviously going to take place during the lifetime of Henry VII, but it was one of Henry VIII's first actions as king. And indeed, he seems to have been incredibly keen to marry Catherine as soon as possible. The marriage license written up by Archbishop Wareham dispensed with the usual requirement for the banns to be read out 3 times on successive Sundays in church, and insisted that it was required only once. And 3 days after the reading of the banns, the couple were married. So they married in haste. So it does seem to be something that Henry was getting, was wanting for himself. The wedding itself was a relatively small affair, took place at Greenwich, but all energies were being reserved for a much larger occasion, the couple's joint coronation, which was held on the 24th of June 1509 at Westminster Abbey. So Henry seems very happy with his choice. After all, if you think about it, he's got the best of both worlds. He's got a foreign alliance with a European military power who could help him recover English lands in France and emanate his hero, Henry V. He also already knew his bride. There was going to be no surprises in terms of her looks, her demeanour, her personality. She'd been in England for about 7 or 8 years by this point, so she knew the language, the culture, the politics. So all the advantages of a foreign match, but paired with personal knowledge already about his bride. He seems to have had a really high level of respect for Catherine, especially and a faith, particularly in her abilities. That was demonstrated in 1513. He appoints a pregnant Catherine regent in his absence when he's off in France leading a campaign. And Catherine, under Catherine's leadership, the English have a victory over the Scottish. The Scottish invade in September 1513, and the ensuing battle at Flodden results in the death of many leading Scottish nobles and the king himself, Henry's brother-in-law, James IV. So everything seems to be going well. The couple had fallen pregnant soon into their marriage. Sadly, Catherine miscarried on the 31st of January 1510. But the following year, on New Year's Day, 1511, she gives birth to a baby boy, and they name the baby boy Henry, after his father, presumably. The parents, obviously, court, the country. Everyone is jubilant. It's such a wonderful occasion. The cannons at the Tower of London are fired off in celebration. Towns and cities throughout the country have what is known as triumphs. They have bell ringing and bonfires and barrels of beer available, presumably for free. In London, you have a grand tournament being held, known as the Westminster Tournament. And here, Henry hogs really he hogs the limelight. He runs 25 courses, more than any other rider that day, and splits 4 lances. So he's feeling good about himself. But devastatingly, in what would turn out, I think, to be clearly a greater tragedy and more significant than anyone at the time could have imagined, the baby boy dies at just 7 weeks old. He dies on the 22nd of February. Catherine would give birth a further 4 times that we know of. A stillbirth in October 1513, a unnamed boy who dies shortly after birth in February 1515, a healthy girl in February 1516, and an unnamed girl who was stillborn in November 1518. The girl born in February 1516, the couple's only surviving child, was, of course, Mary. And her mother, Katherine of Aragon, sees her clearly as heir to the throne. And actually, so did her father, Henry, for a time. Mary would be sent to Ludlow Castle and its sister property, Tickenhill Manor, who, if you're a member of my Patreon, you'll have read the blog that I recently did about Tickenhill Manor, the greatest royal palace you've never heard of. And Mary is sent there as nominal head of the Council of the Marches, and Princess of Wales. She's 9 years old at that point. Catherine's she's happy about the situation, about the position that Mary's given. She's not very happy about Mary having to go away from her, but also, disappointingly for Catherine, the equivalent position in the north, Warden General of the Marches against Scotland, was given to Henry's illegitimate son by Elizabeth Blount, the 6-year-old Henry Fitzroy, who Henry at the same time also made, or around about the same time, made a Knight of the Garter, and he raised him to the peerage as the first Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Henry never formally bestowed the title of Princess of Wales on Mary, although he did refer to her as that quite often. But I think it can be reasonably presumed that that's because he still expected a son to come from this marriage. Fitzroy had been, as a bit of an aside, but he'd been born in June 1519, so possibly conceived while Catherine was pregnant or even in her confinement for the birth, which took place in the November of 1518, which had resulted in the stillborn girl. So the beginnings of the divorce probably came around this time. So you have the stillbirth in 1518. That's the last pregnancy that we know of for Catherine and Henry as a couple. The birth of Henry Fitzroy, the the following year, was proof that Henry could bear sons. So this is the start of it. Why is God not permitting sons to Henry and his wife? Remember here, his accession to the throne had been peaceful, the only transition to have been so in almost 100 years. Henry wanted another peaceful succession. He wanted that to be his legacy, and for this, he needed sons. So Henry begins looking around for an explanation. And the question he has is specifically, why has God not granted him sons? Our retrospective view of Henry's life is 6 marriages. I think often finds the question raised. There's like comparison questions raised. Which one did he love, or which one did he love the most? Perhaps uniquely for kings in this period, personal happiness does seem to have been a consideration for Henry. He expected love in a marriage. And I don't like that there seems to be this need of sort of ranking the wives in order of which one he loved the most. And it sounds really ridiculous. But what I would say is Catherine is often overlooked in those sort of rankings. It tends to be between Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour. But and I think that is because the shorthand is Catherine is kicked out of the marriage bed in favour of Anne Boleyn, with whom the king, has become infatuated. Actually, the relationship between Henry and Anne is far more complex than that, and in fact, we frequently go into that in quite a bit of detail on the Anne Boleyn tour, which I take each May along with Gareth Russell. So if you want to really get into depth with that, with a fantastic historian, we have got spaces on the Anne Boleyn tour in May 2026, so you can find details of that on BritishHistoryTours.com. But anyway, back to Catherine and Henry. I'd argue that his actions throughout this time, and actually quite the way into the divorce, while he's trying to work out what to do about this predicament he finds himself in, demonstrates that I think he does actually really love Catherine. If you think about it, by the time we get to Catherine's final pregnancy, at the point at which Henry could no longer hope really that Catherine's going to give him a son, they had been together for 9 years. If you put that together with the time he'd known her before that, she was one of the only constants in Henry's life from childhood through to adulthood. And I think that makes a difference. They'd enjoyed successes together, heartbreaks together, and they shared a piety, which I think is more often credited to Catherine than Henry. But in short, they had a lot in common and they had been through a lot together. It was going to take a few years to decide to seek an annulment for the marriage. And for a time, he and Catherine still did things together throughout it. Unbelievably, they would dine together, for instance. They would even sleep in the same bed at times, although perhaps sexual relations had ceased, although you never really know what happens. You're not going to know what happens in the privacy of the bedroom, but it's assumed that they do cease. To look at the fact that he divorced her as evidence that he didn't love her, which I think some people do, I think it's too blunt. I mean, if every marriage that ends in divorce is an indication that if every a marriage that ends in divorce had never had any love there at all, then that's a lot of marriages that started off without any love there. But anyway, so Henry's doubts, though, about Catherine's ability to give him a son, for a son to come from his marriage, date back as far back as 1518, perhaps even further back to 1514, when rumours were heard in Rome that the King of England meant to repudiate his wife because he's unable to have children by her. There's a quote. That predates the arrival of Anne Boleyn, who possibly caught the king's eye at a court masque hosted by Wolsey at York Place in March 1522, where she plays Perseverance. So these doubts are already in Henry's mind way before Anne Boleyn. And it was going to prove a long and arduous journey for Henry to decide on a course of action. Unfortunately for Henry, unfortunately actually for a lot of people, it turns out, but we'll get into that. Even once he had decided what must be done, that would prove only to be the start. And it was nowhere near the straightforward solution he was thinking he would get. So whenever they began, the doubts Henry harboured had by about 1520 turned into certainty. He's not going to have sons by Catherine, who's now in her mid 30s. In 1525, Catherine would turn 40, and Henry had to make a decision as to what he's going to do about the succession. Not only was Catherine past childbearing age, but Henry had two accidents, one in 1524, one in 1525, which had almost taken his life. The first one was a jousting accident. The second was when he attempted to pole vault a muddy ditch and ended up head down in the mud. So those incidents focused Henry's mind even more. As hits, if you're not lucky enough, if you're lucky enough not to have got to your mid-30s, then you might not know what I mean when I say the next bit. But you hit your mid-30s and you realise you're not invincible and you're not going to live forever. And this hits Henry, and of course for Henry, there's much larger consequences. The stability of England, the continuation of the Tudor dynasty, his legacy, this all rests on his succession, and he needs to have a plan. He's only the second monarch of the Tudor dynasty. It's not even dynasty. It's not a dynasty if it ends with him. So it must be addressed. He saw no sons as equivalent to childlessness. And that was it was actually an idea put into his head by a canon, or I can't remember who it was, but he saw sonlessness as childlessness. And Catherine, and in terms of the succession, I should say. So Catherine, who had seen her own mother as sovereign of Castile, didn't see the same way at all. However, saying that, the lack of a spare, even if Henry had been content to leave a girl as his heir, which wouldn't have happened anyway, but unless there's two girls, it was a perilous circumstance. Henry himself had been the spare and had replaced his older brother as heir. We also have to remember that there was no precedent for a female succeeding to the throne. It was not barred as it was in France, but it had been attempted once before, when Henry I had named his only surviving legitimate child, a daughter called Matilda, as his heir. Even sworn pledges of allegiance to her, observed during the old king's lifetime, did not prevent the civil war which ensued when Matilda tried to realise her claim after her cousin Stephen had assumed the kingship. So Henry's other option, and one which he was laying the foundations for, was naming his illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy as heir. It was in 1525 that he'd bestowed this double dukedom on Fitzroy, making him Duke of Richmond and Somerset. And those titles chosen for him were significant. They demonstrated his royal blood, because Richmond had been the title of his grandfather Henry VII when he'd been Earl of Richmond, and Somerset was the title of his great-great-grandfather, the father of Margaret Beaufort, John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset. Fitzroy was also named, like I said before, as a Knight of the Order of the Garter, made Lord Admiral, made Warden General of the Marches of Scotland. However, that was not a solution either, because the succession of an illegitimate child could be equally as problematic and a threat to the stability of the country as that of a female. I refer back once again to this peaceful transition that Henry VII had, or Henry VIII had from his father, Henry VII. Henry VIII desperately wanted to create this as part of his own legacy. Catherine had severely objected to Fitzroy's sudden and considerable elevation, as she would, but it did give her a reason to speak to Henry about their daughter's position, and the result being he explicitly recognised Mary as heiress to the throne. So the question, however, of why his marriage had produced no legitimate surviving male children remained a predominant thought in Henry's head. And by 1527, he had decided with certainty that he knew the explanation for why God had not granted him sons. And we must remember, this is a pious age. Henry is a devout Catholic, and he looks to the divine realm for clarity of his predicament. So he looked to the Bible, and here he found what he perceived to be a clear answer, one which explained entirely the reasoning behind the situation he found himself in. And of course, if you already know the story, it's Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, quote, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an impurity. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless," end quote. Henry had married his brother's wife. They'd remained sonless, which, as we've said, Henry sees as equivalent to childless in this verse. That's why that bit's important. His marriage had clearly offended God. It shouldn't have happened. In God's eyes, it wasn't a real marriage. That's why he hadn't granted them sons. The Pope, Julius II, who had issued the dispensation in that original marriage treaty, which had allowed them to marry, he was wrong. God wasn't happy about this, and he was demonstrating it. Henry saw it, that he'd been wronged by the Pope, who, like I say, issued this dispensation. And now his successor, the current Pope, Pope Clement VII, who we covered in obviously the first 2 episodes, and he really did inherit a poison chalice when he took up the papal throne. But anyway, Pope Clement VII, as far as Henry's concerned, he needs to rectify the wrong done to Henry and set things right. God had also put another sign Henry's way, for by now we know he's definitely fallen in love with a woman who refuses to be his mistress. And the only way he's going to realize his love for her in the fullest sense is to marry her. Now, how much notice Henry had taken of Anne Boleyn in 1522, we don't know. We know they're in the same room, but it's unclear how much, like I say, how much notice. But definitely by New Year's Day, 1527, he's very, very serious about her, because at that point she accepts his troth. Henry and Anne Boleyn are now betrothed New Year's Day, 1527. Just as a bit of an aside, because I know a lot of you are interested in Anne Boleyn and the whole Tudor history, again, this is what Anne was trying to do, whether she was as infatuated with Henry as is made out, whether she had a plan or whether she actually genuinely was trying to not get into the situation she ends up in, is another topic that we discuss quite often on the Anne Boleyn tour. So yeah, if you want to get into that in big depth, then do come on the Anne Boleyn tour with me. So Henry in Leviticus, he really does think he has hit on the correct answer. It's so obvious to him that the next stage, achieving the divorce, is going to be straightforward, which explains why he's already pledged his troth to Anne. Of course, there's going to need to be some formality to be created around the proceedings, but he's soon going to be free from his vows to Catherine and able to marry Anne. So on the 17th of May, so back in 1527 now, we've come right up to where we were before, his chief minister, also Archbishop of York, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, opens a court to try the king's marriage at his palace, York Place. Wolsey was judge, and as cardinal, he possessed legatine powers as the Pope's representative in England. And Archbishop Wareham of Canterbury, he sits as assessor. Henry is the defendant in this case. He's charged with unlawful cohabitation with his late brother's wife. Henry obviously isn't going to sit in the dock, and Wolsey has to seek his permission to read the charge against him, which Henry agrees he can do. He then appoints a council and to sit in his place, and he leaves. So bizarrely, Henry's council are there arguing again, well, opposite to what in fact Henry wants. A display has to be made that Henry wants to find his marriage lawful, and by extension, Mary legitimate. The promoter or counsel for the inquiry, the man setting out the case against the validity of Pope Julius II's dispensation, and therefore the whole basis of Henry's marriage, was a man called Dr. Richard Woolman. He did a very thorough job, and part of his preparations, he'd visited Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester, who had been a member of the government at the time of Catherine's marriage to Arthur. He'd also been closely involved in the negotiations for the marriage contracts of both Catherine's marriages, so to Arthur and to Henry. Woolman asks the bishop specifically about whether the marriage of Arthur and Catherine was believed to have been consummated. And Fox testifies that it was indeed believed that as the couple lived together in London and then in Ludlow, following their wedding, that they had consummated their marriage. So Woolman presents his arguments on the 31st of May and requests that Wolsey test his arguments and arrive at a judgment. Wolsey, however, in what retrospectively could have been the decision that changed the course of history, and it certainly affected Wolsey's fate, for reasons which are not clear, Wolsey pronounced the case too difficult to make a conclusive judgment on, and that he was going to have to refer it up, basically. He could simply have been telling the truth as he saw it, because if you're going to take Leviticus literally, then there's actually a passage in Deuteronomy which, quote, says, quote, "When brethren dwell together and one of them dies without children, the wife of the deceased shall not marry to another, but his brother shall take her and raise up seed for his brother." So it seems to be saying the opposite. One argument, Henry's preference, is to ignore Deuteronomy at all. It's relevant to Jews, it's not relevant to Christians, and actually even in the Jewish community, it had begun to be ignored. And the other viewpoint, which had been developed in canon law, was that Leviticus was correct, but with the exception of the circumstance set out in Deuteronomy. So, i.e., you don't marry your brother's widow unless he dies and the couple haven't had children, they're childless. The exception applied here, and Wolsey probably knew it. And the upshot of this was the case was going to have to be referred to Rome. And yes, probably at the time he thought this was his safest option. He's not going to offend Rome, and he's going to get out of having to make a decision that maybe he'll be blamed for in England. Wolsey delivers the news that he has adjourned the proceedings, and in a letter on the 2nd of June. So the opportunity now for a quick decision made in England has passed, or it's the first opportunity for it, and it would now be up to the Pope to judge the case. But there was a second piece of bad news in Wolsey's letter. Word had now reached Wolsey of the terrible events in Rome, that the mutinous imperial army had invaded Rome, and all of the barbarity which had followed, the shocking barbarity. Pope Clement VII was now effectively a captive of Charles V, who was Catherine's nephew. So only 1 month earlier, Henry had been looking at getting a quick, decisive verdict. He could even have been married again by now. As it would turn out, it would be another 5.5 years until Henry would marry Anne Boleyn, by which time she was probably in her late 20s, if not already 30. And we can only guess how many pregnancies could have been fit into that time. However, in 1527, no one could have guessed how events would unfold and how long they would take. So for now, a delegation, would be sent to the Pope. But where's the Pope? Because Rome's been sacked. Well, we know that in December 1527, Pope Clement VII was at the Papal Palace at Orvieto. He'd been released from Castel Sant'Angelo. He'd managed to flee the almost 80 miles to the old papal summer palace. It's actually equidistant between Rome and Florence, actually. The palace had originally been built in the 13th century. A number of popes had lived there and built on it, but it hadn't been in regular use for perhaps a century, maybe even more, by the time Pope Clement VII escapes there in 1527. Pope Pius II had stayed there for a short time in 1460, and in 1460 he was commenting on the ruin of the city, which had apparently, according to him, come around due to civil strife. So anyway, the palace is in a bad state of repair, and this is where Pope Clement VII receives the English delegation sent by Wolsey, and they reported actually that the Pope was lodging, quote, in an old palace of the bishops of this city, ruinous and decayed. So they'd actually had to make their way through a swampland to reach it, and tragically, one of their attendants had actually drowned attempting to cross that swamp. So it sounds like it was, not in a good state. The delegation was, the main men of the delegation were Bishop Gardiner and Edward Fox, and they arrived on the 20th of March, 1528, with instructions from Wolsey for how to go about negotiating the annulment for the king's marriage. By the time the envoy were face to face with the Pope, he'd already received direct communication from the Emperor Charles V, nephew of Katherine of Aragon, who called it an ugly affair and actually suggested that the Pope revoke Wolsey's powers. Because Wolsey, I should say, for anyone who doesn't know, he's got all the badges. He's Archbishop of York. He's a cardinal, so he's a cardinal. So the Pope has bestowed those powers on him. He's also chancellor. He's all sorts. So the delegation, though, proposed to the Pope on Wolsey's orders that the trial for the validity of the marriage, they would like to hold it in England now, because they're worried that the Pope is influenced by Charles V now, because Charles V's troops were the ones who overtook Rome, and they're running riot still around. And they asked for what's called a decretal commission, and this would set out the law that needed to be tried. The judges hear the evidence and they basically cast a verdict based on the specific law they've been asked to try. So providing that that law is set out in the right way, Wolsey and Henry thought this would be a quick fix. Wolsey must be kicking himself at this point. The trial would be back in England if they get their own way. It'll be relatively straightforward, quick, conclusive. Boom. Henry can get Henry can get his marriage annulled and marry Anne. The Pope has a lot to consider. So Charles V is effectively his captor. But as Wolsey points out, if Henry can't get his annulment for his marriage, then England might go the same way as Germany, where the Lutheran heresy is taking hold. And the Lutherans haven't got much truck by the Pope. So as we saw as well in episode 1, Clement isn't a particularly decisive man. He's often tried to keep open his options in case there's a change in the power dynamic, which there often was between Spain and France in particular. Well, in France, it's Spain and France, basically. All that had earned him really was disdain from the kings, Francis I of France and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who's also the King of Spain. But now Clement has to consider Henry VII and England as well. Does he want to risk another country going the way of Germany? And at the moment, Wolsey can argue that Henry is acting in Clement's interests. He's going to back Clement because in July 1527, Wolsey obviously had realised that Charles V is going to have a lot more influence on Clement than he even has up to now. Francis I and Charles are sworn enemies, as we covered in episode 1. And the treaty that's drawn up, Henry is going to support Francis I in any French action against Charles V and to free the Pope. Now, of course, the English, Henry and his court, want to free the Pope because obviously they're in the hope that it means he's going to be free of Charles V's influence and he can grant Henry his annulment quickly and cleanly. Clement granted the decretal commission. He appoints Wolsey and another cardinal, Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, to judge it. Campeggio was Cardinal Protector of England in Rome and absentee Bishop of Salisbury. Catherine and her supporters, they're not happy with these appointments because these judges are both English bishops. Therefore, they receive English money, and they thought that was biased. Of course, Henry thinks it's biased if it's held in Rome because of Charles V's influence. But Clement is satisfied that Campeggio, his first and foremost loyalties are to the papacy. So he would also trust Campeggio with instructions to drag out the proceedings as long as possible in the hope that something else, some other event is going to intervene, perhaps a French victory, perhaps Henry's going to lose interest in Anne Boleyn. But as an aside, a fact that actually was shared by Wolsey, who had completely underestimated, at least at the beginning, how serious Henry was about marrying Anne. Maybe Catherine would do as other queens had done and step back and take the veil, become a nun. Against Clement's better judgment, he gives the request for the decretal commission, but he stipulates that that it must stay in Campeggio's hands and only be shown to Wolsey and Henry. So it's quite secretive. Campeggio is, like I say, given these instructions to drag proceedings out as long as possible. Clearly, Clement is just hoping it sort of sorts itself out and he doesn't have to take any direct action. And Campeggio, he actually really does travel slowly. He's got gout. It makes it really painful to ride. He had to be carried in a litter because he couldn't ride. But eventually he arrives in England on the 9th of October, and he reaches London on the 9th of October, and he lodges in the Bishop of Bath's house near Temple. It's an easy journey by boat to Bridewell Palace, where Henry and Catherine have now taken up residence ready for the hearing, which is going to be held at I think it's Blackfriars, which was right next to Bridewell. So Clement's now found himself in between Charles V and Henry VIII in a situation not of his doing, which Clement finds himself in lots of situations which had been begun by other popes. And he does seem mildly, if not more than mildly, irritated by the whole matter. He wishes that Wolsey had just concluded this when he had the chance in 1527. If the decision had been made, without the Pope's authority, rightly or wrongly, it would have absolved Clement of the decision, of the outcome. He actually also had little sympathy for Catherine's cause, and he was frustrated about why she wouldn't take the veil. He considered that individual injury, to one person was something preferable over the result of what escalation of an individual grievance could result in. He'd just seen the sack of Rome. Campeggio actually did firmly press Catherine on a number of occasions, encouraging her to take the veil, but she'd always refuse. And it would have left her position and that of her daughter intact and left Henry free to marry. But like I say, she refused. She also refused to accept the validity of the cardinals to hear her case. She was pushing this claim that there was an unfair bias against her position due to which men had actually been chosen to hear the case. So she was still pushing for the hearing to be held back in Rome, which I think clearly Clement would have done already had he have wanted to. Now, the whole matter rested on whether she'd had sexual intercourse with her first husband, Henry's older brother Arthur, but she would defend that she'd been a virgin when she married Henry so convincingly that it's a debate today, and we're going to have that debate after I finish this. Let's have a debate in the comments. But she sticks with this absolutely, that she was a virgin when she marries Henry. On the 26th of October, 1528, Catherine requests confession with Cardinal Campeggio. She allows, even encourages, the breaking of the secrecy of confession to let it be known that she remained, quote, intact and uncorrupted, end quote, by Arthur. If Catherine was a virgin on her wedding day to Henry VIII, then his entire case, was invalid. Let me say that again. If Catherine was a virgin on her wedding day to Henry VIII, his entire case is invalid. So a detailed discussion of what happens beyond 1528, that's outside of the scope of this series because we're putting it in the context of the sack of Rome and where Clement VII finds himself. What I will say is that it is very complex. There's many arguments, there's counter arguments made, multiple threads of strategy from each party. What seems clear when I've researched this is that it could have been over fairly quickly, and leaving both parties relatively, Catherine might argue this, unscathed compared to what happened in the end. Of course, it's not a spoiler, but to let you know that Henry VIII did eventually marry Anne Boleyn. They marry in June 1533, despite Clement VII actually writing to Henry in 1530, forbidding him to marry again and threatening to excommunicate him. But clearly, Henry's not listening. And in fact, at the time of their wedding, Henry was to Anne Boleyn. Henry was still technically married to Catherine. Their marriage wasn't. So Catherine and Henry's marriage wasn't formally annulled until May of 1533. He'd married Anne in January of 1533, and it was annulled by the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who Henry had appointed, called Thomas Cranmer, who we've covered in previous episodes because he's one of the martyrs under Mary I. And he rules that the original papal dispensation was invalid, and therefore Henry had never been married to Catherine, and therefore his marriage to Anne was true and valid. Now, that is not accepted by Catholic Europe, and of course, that becomes an issue for Henry and Anne's daughter, Elizabeth I. again, not for today, but so I've covered a lot, and I've purposely not kept an eye on the comments while I've been doing it so that I wasn't distracted. But I would love to know your thoughts. So I will have a look in a moment what you've been saying. So, do you think Henry was right to seek a divorce? Can you see it from his point of view? Do you think Catherine was right to prevent it so I was gonna say stubbornly. She was, I mean, she was, I suppose, stubborn about it. Um, so yeah, can you see it from both sides? Do you have a particular thought on it? Let me have a look what people have been saying while we take a small break from what I was going to cover. Um, Makeup and monarchies, I love that. They were married the longest, yes, Catherine and Henry. Looks like they had a decent marriage prior to the 1520s. And actually, I think that's a really good point, and it's again missed because he has 6 wives. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I think would have happened if he didn't have 6 wives. Yeah, they're married for 20 years, obviously the last 5 or so. But I think he definitely I think he definitely loved her. Did Henry see Anne at the Field of Cloth of Gold? Anne was at the Field of Cloth of Gold, this peace summit in, was it 1522? I'm remembering that off the top of my head, so please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But we don't know of them meeting there. And yes, Henry was having an affair apparently with Anne's sister Mary. So Shano, I do not think Henry was worried about his soul in this situation. I think he was trying to find a way to get his way. I think, see that, yeah, that's one of the arguments that people make, and it could be very well be true. We've never met Henry in person. We don't really know how pious he was. I come down on the side that he probably did believe that he defended God. Things aren't going his way. Francis is over there in France with enough sons to ransom 2 of them off without care. But Henry's not got a son, and his father had won on the battlefield. Henry's not managing to prove himself in any way, and he's also not going to leave sons. He's annoyed God somehow. Yeah, the hearing in 1527 that Wolsey oversaw, I hadn't realised really until I did this research just what an opportunity that had been to get it tied up quickly. So 1520, I was correct. Thank you. Could Henry obtain divorce if Anne Boleyn was in question as the bride to be? So it seems that when Henry starts divorce proceedings, Anne may not have been on the scene. Henry's looking to get out of it because he does need an heir, and he doesn't know where it's come from. And like we covered, we think he considers Henry Fitzroy, but doesn't seem to. That's kind of a really last backstop, if you like. Tina says Catherine should have gone into a convent for the sake of her daughter in the country. Other queens in Europe had done it. Maria says no, he had no grounds because he was a homicidal maniac and a serial killer. Well, a lot of that was to come, but yeah, he'd been pretty bad already. And but Catherine equally ruined her life out of stubbornness, and finally neither here nor there. But so yeah, we'll see what Maria was going to finish off with. Thank you, Tina. Amazing research. Thank you. It's very interesting. I haven't done it yet, but I'll put in the show notes the different articles and books that I've been reading to come up with this, because of course, you might have a different interpretation, but I've tried to keep it as clear as I can. Maria finishes off with, but I still maintain, regardless of whether she was a virgin or not, that it's such ick that he married his late brother's widow. It is, but when I thought about it, I thought he really has. I think he really has got almost the best situation that any new king would have found himself in. She's foreign, so she's completely the correct rank. She is a princess. She's a princess of a powerful European country, well, 2 countries. Her mum and dad are kick-ass. I mean, they did some questionable things. But she is in the country. He knows her, and I do wonder how much a continuity from childhood into adulthood would have been important to Henry. I think if you've I think if you've been through a traumatic childhood, there are there are things that are your crutches, and I feel like Catherine perhaps was a sign of continuity for Henry. Shane, didn't Henry VII think about marrying Catherine himself? Apparently so, yes. Yes, but that didn't come to anything. And yes, so we will, I tell you what, we will let me finish. I'm going to finish this bit off because there's other bits I want you to think about as well. And then we're going to do the 3-minute explainer, which Tina had asked me to cover a little while ago. So thank you, Tina. And that is the debate over whether I think or whether I think Katherine of Aragon and Arthur consummated the marriage. Okay, so one of the aims that I had of this mini series was to put Henry's divorce proceedings into the context of the European relations, which had led to the sack of Rome in 1527. And of course, the event itself, put more detail around the sack of Rome and just how horrendous it was. There are a few elements which occurred to me as I researched the topic that possibly as a result of simplification of a very complicated and complex set of events have been presented in a way that perhaps misleads the reader, not at all on purpose, and this is not a criticism. You know, somebody else could research what I've just researched for you and give you a slightly different take on it because there's a lot going on. And I think there is a need to simplify a complex story. I mean, I actually sometimes receive feedback on my videos. People say I'm jumping from topic to topic, and I thought, well, how can that be? Because I am actually speaking about one particular topic. But I think what that can be is I'm trying to cover as much detail as possible, and there's a challenge there in getting the detail without it being too noisy and confusing. So that being said, here are some of my thoughts, points that occurred to me that I thought that I'd be interested to know your thoughts on. So let's go back to the sack of Rome for a moment. Before my research, before I went deep, I understood that the sacking of Rome was an attack on Rome by Charles V as a revenge on and a show of power over Clement VII, and that Pope Clement VII didn't agree to the annulment of Henry's marriage purely because he was Charles V's prisoner. Now, that was my interpretation of what I've seen and read. So on the point of the sacking of Rome being an attack by Charles V, that to me implies a strategy, a plan, an objective, which we've seen is not the case when we covered it in episodes 1 and 2. It implies that Charles V had control over the troops, but there is a lot of evidence to call that into question. How much control did Charles really have? Charles had issued a joint order with the Pope before the troops had decided to march to Rome while they were still on the outskirts of Florence, and they'd rejected it. And it included an order from Charles that the troops were to leave Italy. And then it had that sweetener of money that the Pope thought would be fine, which just riled them up. So watch episode 1. It's great. I really enjoyed doing that one. The other thing to say about that is that the cardinals aligned to the emperor were victims of the sack too. as were imperial cardinals. Fernando Ponsetti and Andrea della Valle, they were extorted for money and beaten if they didn't comply. Ponsetti died from his wounds after he was attacked. So how much Charles planned, it wasn't planned. There was no objective and he hadn't got control. So that was point one. That was the first point that it challenged what I had sort of understood. The second one, Pope Clement VII didn't agree to the annulment of Henry's marriage purely because he's Charles V's prisoner. Clearly, Charles V, being the most powerful man in Europe at this time, and the sack is going to make Clement feel vulnerable. But despite communications from Charles about the matter, he didn't decide against Henry either. He doesn't grant the annulment, but he equally doesn't say, you're not getting anything, you have to remain married. He doesn't do that. So Wolsey had already had the opportunity, as we know, to decide on the matter. He hadn't. So were the concerns that he'd had over Henry's justification for the annulment real? Perhaps. And perhaps the Pope had the same. Perhaps he wasn't that interested in the whole matter. The Pope still at the point where he takes the English delegation is unable to go back to the Vatican. He's got bigger issues on his mind and he's probably traumatized. What Henry thinks of his great matter is a irritation for Clement. Also, it calls into question Clement's integrity as Pope. If does he see his position as head of the church, or as his primary position, or is that secondary to European politics? Which the idea that he will just do Charles V's bidding seems to suggest. I mean, we know, again, from episode 2, I think this was, we know that he sold cardinal hats to raise money, but he'd objected to doing so initially, and he only did so in order to raise money to defend the city because the rich men of the city had refused to help, and the imperial forces were advancing on it. And we know Clement was playing for time. So perhaps, reasonably, he believed that something else is going to happen and take the problem away. Henry was a problem for another day. And unfortunately for everyone involved, putting off that problem for another day actually just made it a problem for every day for many years. So they're my thoughts, and I'd love to know yours. So just to round it off, we've had this mini-series. We've seen treason, the imprisonment of a king, Francis I being prisoner of Charles V, the imprisonment of a pope, ransomed princes, horror unleashed on the Holy City, and all within the context of Henry. All within that context, Henry VIII is trying to secure his succession, and we also have Catherine's broken heart, which I think is real. And Henry VIII had pinned his annulment hopes on Pope Clement VII, but Clement was either unable or unwilling to grant Henry his wishes in full. If he'd been able to do, we're going to get into some what-ifery now. If he had been able to do that, perhaps England would have remained a Catholic country for longer. Perhaps Anne Boleyn would have had time on her side and would have been able to produce a multitude of children. So perhaps the religious pendulum from Protestantism to Catholicism and back again, which occurred during the reigns of Henry's children, all half-siblings, wouldn't have happened. I wonder that if Henry had got his own way, whether we would even talk about Henry VIII as much as we do. Because for my two penneth, whatever it's worth, it isn't Henry. I think without the notoriety of having 6 wives, which makes Henry a topic of conversation, either because of the wives or because of the events and situation around marrying those women, I don't think there'd be a lot to talk about with him. That's what I think anyway. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're doing that, let me just tell you about a few things that might be of interest to you. Before I do that, a reminder that if you want to see the first 2 episodes, if you haven't, then you can find them on YouTube. You need to go to the live tab because they were streamed live. You can also find them on the British History Podcast, which is on Apple and Spotify, and also on my Substack too, which is substack.com/at British History. I think you can also search my name there and I come up there as well. So let's Makeup and Monarchies agrees with me 1000% that as a king he wasn't all that he wasn't all that great. I wonder what would we talk about? What would we talk about? There were other kings who did more and are more interested that don't have the same interest. His story lends itself to dramatization, and it's a hook, isn't it? 6 wives. Shane, do we know how much the dowry was worth? Oh, thank you. Makeup and Monica's looked up 2,000 ducats, whatever that was. Well, I don't know what that is in today's money. A lot. And Henry VII, yeah, he wants to get his hands on what he sees as his money. Maya says, I hope that's how you pronounce it. Katharina was a deeply religious woman. If she did not come to the same conclusion as Henry, she had a son, but it was not her fault that he died. Yes, that all. It's very, very sad that her. So she, I suppose, was also wondering why God wasn't granting them sons, but she saw it in a very different way. It is a bit of a mystery to me, anyway, as to why, being that religious and pious, the option of taking the veil was so abhorrent to her. Well, maybe abhorrent's not the right word, but she wasn't going to do it. So Shane says, don't think Henry VII wanted to pay back the dowry. Oh no, he was never going to pay back the first bit, and he definitely wanted the second bit. So let's look. Tina, had Anne had a boy in those years, it would have changed so much of history and the lives of hundreds of people in some way. Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. So, and yes, we would have had likely less interest in Henry VIII. Okay. So, Tina, you asked me if I thought Catherine of Aragon had consummated her marriage with Arthur. But hang on, just before I do that, Shano seems to think he's got a Shano has got, sorry, my lips bleeding. Shano has got a equivalent in US dollars for 200,000 ducats. I don't know how to say that though. Is that 56 trillion? 6,000 billion? 600 billion? A lot. That can't be right. That can't be right. That's like more money than in the world at the time. I don't think that's right. I think maybe we could lose a few zeros off that. Maya, did we have other examples of couples whose children died and who doubted their marriage? I don't know. Maybe. Not that I can think of the top of my head. Shana says, why not? Because Henry VII, England and Henry VII's dynasty was not that important for Castile and Aragon to make an alliance with. Catherine was their youngest daughter. So no, the dowries were not in the trillions. They just wouldn't. That's just out. So that's too much. That is too much. Believe me, that's too much. So anyway, my thoughts on whether they consummated the marriage. Oh, this is why it's a debate. This is why it's a debate. Because to disbelieve Catherine, you have to call into question her integrity, whether you believe Catherine of Aragon would lie about something so important. However, then you could also say it's so important that for a greater good, she would lie. I don't know. The confession with Cardinal Campeggio, though, and also I covered this a bit when I can't remember. I did an episode on Arthur, and I've got an interview which you can watch with Gareth Benjamin Streeter, who wrote wrote an autobiography, not an autobiography, wrote a biography on Arthur Tudor. And in fact, that's the one to watch. Watch the interview with Gareth Benjamin Streeter, because he talks about how there had been concerns about Arthur's development as he hits puberty, um, and whether he is actually ready for marriage. He, Arthur makes comments that have been interpreted as proof that he did sleep with Catherine. Willoughby, bring me a cup of ale for this night. I've been in the midst of Spain. Um, but that could have been young bravado saying what I think for every obviously a teenage boy is going to try to sleep with his new wife, there is maybe as many situations as where boys have pretended that they have because they haven't, and they know they're supposed to have done or they're expected to have done. Which, I mean, no one knows because it wasn't an issue at the time. It had been presumed that they had. Indeed, when Catherine made her way back from Ludlow, so these are the things that make me question Catherine. When she makes her way back from Ludlow to London after Arthur's death, she comes back in stages because they are being careful in case she was pregnant. So there's that. There's also what I mentioned earlier, which, and I don't know because I've not seen this discussed, but when the marriage treaty for her wedding to Henry is drawn up, she's old enough to know what's going on. She doesn't, as far as I know, and I could be wrong on this, but doesn't raise the fact that she doesn't need, or that a papal dispensation isn't required. I mean, it requires other things, her to know about it, her to understand what was needed, someone to not brush her off and just say, "Well, we'll get it anyway, it's belt and braces." But those two things make me wonder. But then if you listen to Gareth Benjamin Streeter talk about the concerns over Arthur's health and his development, then I don't also think it's a given that just because they were married and because they were married for 5 months, that anything happened. So I don't know. It's my answer. It's my answer. So, yeah, I think there is a lot made in documents about. Well, so apparently the sheets with blood on were sent back to Spain as proof um, after her marriage to Arthur. But not to go into any detail, it's not. That's not. That's not an exact science in this scenario. No, and Makeup and Monica just said yes. Catherine would die on the hill. She absolutely would lie to save herself and her daughter. And I see that I can completely get behind as well. So there we go. I think it's a fascinating story. I hope you've enjoyed the mini series. I've enjoyed putting it more putting Henry's divorce into the context properly of the sack of Rome. I think Henry's great matter could argue have been a gnat flying around Clement's head while his feet are in the fire. So let's finish off with, I'm going to tell you what I'm doing next time, and then we're going to finish off with what AI has conjured up for me this week. So next time, it's going to be a little bit different. The 14th of April is the next show. Now, I've been traveling around the country for the last 6 or so months, maybe more, filming with really interesting people at historic sites. So I have some fantastic videos to share with you. And on the 14th of April, I'm going to share the first of these with you. It is an interview with the archivist Rebecca Phillips at Gloucester Cathedral Library. She chose some fascinating and incredibly rare objects to show me, some of which members of my Patreon have already seen, because I do behind the scenes posts in my Patreon. So if I'm off filming or visiting somewhere, then I will share a few photos of where I am and what I'm doing. So some of you would have already seen a little sneak preview of what we're going to cover, but objects and books covered include an Anglo-Saxon text. It's like a shadow text as well, part of it. It's amazing. The deed of endowment, excuse me, is issued by Henry VIII. There's a mini sketch of him on it, which is great. You're going to love that. And a reliquary said to contain a relic from Bishop Hooper's stake. And we covered Bishop Hooper on the 17th of February. So if you didn't catch that episode, then again, go to the live tab on my YouTube or have a look for it on the podcast or my Substack. You'll find it there as well. And if you did catch that one about Bishop Hooper, then this reliquary, which is difficult to say, is I think going to be of interest to you. I also got to visit the Parliament rooms, which isn't accessible to the public. And this is where they think Henry VIII held court while he was at Gloucester in 1535. That was part of his progress that he did with Henry VIII. Henry VIII was there because it was his progress, the progress that he did with Anne Boleyn. So look out for that. I'm sure you will enjoy that. So let's finish off with the AI. Honestly, I don't even know whether I don't know if I'm disturbed, amused, or just I'll show you. So the first event that I wanted AI to create a video representation, I tried to be really specific because I thought, right, maybe it'll get it. And I asked it to show, I'll put it up, to show Queen Charlotte banging on the doors of Westminster Abbey. So just banging on the closed doors of Westminster Abbey. This is inspired by actually it was Gareth Benjamin Streeter again, when he and James came on History After Dark, and we talked about the cock-up that was George the Fourth's coronation. Anyway, this is what AI came up with for me. Let's see if I can get on. And okay, I'm gonna have to play this for you a couple of times. So we've got the Westminster Abbey pillars. For anyone who's listening, that's okay. But Queen Charlotte is dressed in 1950s, maybe, with an apron. She's definitely been baking. Her legs, though, appear to be on back to front. She's coming out of the door when I said it was a closed door. And she also comes away with half the door in her arm. I don't know what that's supposed to be. Then I was also inspired by another. I was reading, I'm reading a lot about the Anglo-Saxon period at the moment. Really, really enjoying it. And there was a escape from the Tower of London I can't remember who. It was an attempted escape, actually. And whoever it was that I can't remember now, tried to escape down knotted sheets. Anyway, he ended up falling. So I asked AI to create for me someone escaping from the Tower of London down a rope. And what it came up with, I mean, we've got a tower, fine. We've got I think that's supposed to be the rope. Like, it's like it looks like a green drain pipe, actually. But then what we have is, instead of trying to escape, a man in a suit just retreats back into the tower. So that's not much of an escape. It's bizarre. I'm really glad I don't rely on this technology to actually come up with anything. I'm sure I could pay for a super duper one or something, but I think I'll leave it. It amuses me far too much to watch whatever rubbish this is. so, so thank you so much for joining me, everybody. I really, really appreciate it. So I hope you enjoy the interview with Rebecca Phillips on the 14th of April, and you will be able to find me in the meantime at substack.com/at British History. I am on Instagram a lot of the time, so at British_history_tours. You can obviously always find me on Facebook, and of course you can find me here on YouTube. I will have other things coming out as well. I'm going to start a few mashup, is that the right term? Where, if you're going on a long journey, or you're someone who likes to put a podcast on to go to sleep to, or whatever, I'm going to be putting together some long compilations so that I can keep you company. Or maybe it's the interviews I do, so it's the other amazing historians that I have interviewed that can keep you company as well. So you can look out for that as well. If you want to keep in touch with everything I'm doing, Substack is a great place to go, because I do my newsletter. And if you want more, then Patreon is the place, patreon.com/British History, because I can give so much more there than I can on all the free channels. All right, everyone, I'm going to leave you to your morning, evening, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. Have a great one, and I'll see you really soon. Bye-bye.